Hello again. So we're back with the second part of the human respiratory system, part dos. And in this one, we're focusing mainly on the structures of the respiratory system and inhalation and exhalation. Now, I also feel it's really important that before we get going, that we remember this little part about the things that people get wrong all the time. So what's the difference between breathing and respiration? Breathing is inhaling and exhaling. Respiration is using the oxygen to release energy from our food. Where does gas exchange take place? It takes place in the alveoli in the lungs, whereas respiration takes place in every cell in the body. So breathing is inhaling and exhaling, which happens in the lungs. It leads to gas exchange, which takes place in the alveoli, and then the oxygen gets transported around the body where it takes place, or where it enters cells, and respiration takes place. So, looking at the respiratory system then, if we start off just at the very top here and work our way down, first structure we've got here is the larynx, which is basically your voice box. So it's this area here. So air moves in through there. It travels down through your windpipe, which is also known as your trachea. In fact, I say it's also known, that is what it's known as. It's sometimes called your windpipe. It then travels down and it travels through this little tube here, which you have two of them. And this one is your left bronchus. So you've got a left and a right bronchus. So the trachea branches off into your bronchus. Now, because you've got two of them, sometimes they're just called bronchi. Now, those branch off into smaller tubes called bronchioles or bronchioles. So we've got your trachea branching off that, or your bronchi, and then branching off further are your bronchioles. So the trachea, your windpipe, is the biggest one. It branches off into a bronchus, because with two of them, bronchi, and then it branches off even more so into smaller bronchioles. Now, after that, we have several different structures around them. So here we have got ribs, or the rib cage, which surrounds your lungs. You have got this part here, which is your left lung. Now, remember where this is as if we're looking at somebody. So this is the left-hand side of their body, and this is the right-hand side. Down at the bottom, we have got your heart, which just sits in the middle of your two lungs, slightly to the left. We've then got, down at the bottom, this big pink sheet of muscle called the diaphragm. But it's important to get the spelling of that right, because it's a strange one. It's got a cheeky wee G in the middle. So if you think of diaphragm whenever you're trying to work out how to spell this. Now, as well as that, we have got over here our right lung. Now, we've got some other structures as well. So on the left hand side, this is our whole structures. So we've got the ribs untouched, the lungs, but then on the right hand side, it's as if everything's been cut. So this part is cut open to show a cut rib. Here we've got intercostal muscles, which are just little muscles which can contract or relax and change the ribs whenever we're breathing in or breathing out. And then at the end of each little bronchiole, we've got little air sacs there, which are alveoli. So that's our respiratory system, made up of the trachea, bronchi, which go into two lungs, In the lungs, the bronchi branch off into bronchioles, and around the outside or at the end of the bronchioles, we've got little alveoli. As well as that, we've got a diaphragm down below, which separates your thorax. So imagine this is a little person. Your diaphragm is in there. It separates your thorax from your abdomen. And then we've got ribs which surround the thorax. So, just looking here, these are little alveoli. So at the end of each bronchiole, it'll branch off into these little air sacs, which are called alveoli. This is where gas exchange takes place, which is basically where oxygen is exchanged for carbon dioxide. To facilitate that, we've got little capillaries, which contain blood, which is going to be used to transport the gases around the body. So later on, what we're going to look at is how the alveoli are adapted for gas exchange. Now, as well as that, we've also got pleural membranes, which line the chest wall or the ribs and the outside of the lungs. The space between the membranes, which is known as the pleural cavity, contains a small amount of pleural fluid to reduce friction between the lungs and the inside of the chest wall. So that means that whenever we breathe in and out, even though our lungs might be rubbing up against the inside of our chest wall, we don't really feel it because it's well lubricated by the pleural fluid. So the ribs can basically move about past the chest wall and there's no friction. So, describe the pathway taken by a single molecule of oxygen from the point where it enters the nose until it reaches one of the tiny alveoli in the lungs. So pause the video here and see if you can work it out. Now, as a little hint, look back at your diagram, put your finger on the page and try and trace out where it would have to go to reach the alveoli. So, it would have to go from the nasal cavity, which is in the nose, past the larynx, down the trachea, down the bronchus, through the bronchioles, until it reaches the alveoli. Now, I should just mention here that we've said alveoli because alveoli is plural. We have lots of them. But alveolus is a singular. Okay, so just to make sure that we're clear on that, alveolus is when we're talking about one, so it's singular. Alveoli is if we're talking about loads of them, and that is plural. Now, while we're here, we may as well just do that to make sure we're clear on this. Bronchus is singular. Bronchi is plural. So this next part then, you should pause it here and try and work out what each part of the respiratory system does. So which part does what? So for example, if you thought number one, the alveoli was the first tube of the respiratory system with the rings of cartilage, you would just write 1D. Now, I'll give you a clue, it's definitely not that. So pause it here, see if you can work it out. So here we go. The alveoli is where gas exchange takes place. Ribs protect the lungs. Intercostal muscle are muscles in between the ribs that contract and relax. Trachea is the first tube of the respiratory system, contains rings of cartilage. The cartilage is to just keep the airway open. The pleural membranes reduce friction between the lungs and the chest wall. The bronchi, there's two of these that take air to each lung. The diaphragm is a large muscle that separates the thorax and abdomen. And the bronchioles are the smallest branches in the lungs that take air to the alveoli. Now, we should just mention this in passing. So, these little things here, this shows a magnified image of some cells that you find in the lung. So, what we're saying here is that cold, dry, dirty air might damage the lungs, so it's warmed, moistened, filtered, and cleaned in part of the breathing system. Cells in the nose and trachea make slimy mucus, which traps dust and germs. And the cilia beat to carry the mucus up your nose and throat. So, if we look at this little animation, this shows us the relationship between the cilia and mucus. So the mucus is produced by goblet cells in the lungs. It traps dirt and microbes and helps prevent infection. So it's really important and really useful. And the cilia are fine hair-like structures found on lung cells. Now I should say that the lung cells that have these are called ciliated epithelial cells. So ciliated epithelial cells contain cilia and they waft to and fro to push the mucus upwards. Now the next section that we're on to is breathing. Now the whole point of breathing is to bring oxygen into the lungs and remove carbon dioxide. So we basically want to bring air into the lungs so that gas exchange can happen in the alveoli. Now the good thing about this is everybody has to breathe, so there's quite a few things that you'll be able to get just by sitting down and trying to work it out. So let's get into this. Now the main structures that we're going to really be looking at here are the intercostal muscles, the ribs, the diaphragm, and then as a result of what those three things are doing, we talk about volume and pressure. So we talk about ribs, intercostal muscles, the diaphragm, and then we go on, after we've talked about those three things, what effect does that have on both the volume and the pressure in the lungs, and as a result of that, which way does air move? So when we're breathing in, and do this along here, so when we're breathing in, our intercostal muscles contract. That has the effect of pulling our rib cage up and out, and at the same time your diaphragm muscle contracts and it flattens. So it would be fine to say for this part your diaphragm contracts and flattens. So your intercostal muscles contract, your rib cage moves up and out. So if you take a big deep breath in, you can actually feel your rib cage moving up and out. Your diaphragm goes flat. Now, by your rib cage becoming up and out and bigger, and your diaphragm pulling down, it increases the volume of your thorax. That decreases the pressure in the thorax, so air gets drawn into your lungs. Now, if you look at this little animation, you can actually see that happening. So here, you can see your diaphragm moving down, your ribs moving out, and then you can see the volume increasing. Now breathing out then, or expiring, this is like a trip to opposite land. So whatever we've said here, it's going to be the opposite over here. So take a big deep breath out. In this, we can see that our intercostal muscles relax. The rib cage is moved down and in. So big breath out. The diaphragm muscle will relax and become dome shaped. So the diaphragm relaxes and becomes dome shaped. This decreases the volume. So it increases the pressure in the thorax. So air is expelled. Now again, looking at this, the diaphragm moves up, rib cages move in, so the volume in the lungs decreases, which forces air upwards and out. Now let's have a look at our little friend here. So what's going to happen is they're going to inhale. So remember, things that we talk about here is the diaphragm, the ribs and the intercostal muscles. So breathing in, you can see the diaphragm flattens, the ribs move up and out, and the intercostal muscles contract. That means that the volume of the lungs get bigger, the pressure decreases, so air moves in. Now, what about exhalation then? So in this case, the diaphragm moves up, the rib cages move down and in, and we see the volume decreasing. So let's just watch that continuously. So we breathe in, the volume increases. Breathe out, the volume decreases. Breathe in, volume increases, and out, volume decreases. Now, we've actually got a really cool model of the lungs, and it's known as the bell jar model. So, this can be used to show the process of breathing. Now, here's the parts that we got. So we've got a glass tube going in, and this represents the trachea. We've then got two of these little tubes, which represent bronchi. We've then got the balloons, which represent the lungs. The bell jar itself represents the rib cage, or the thorax. So, bell jar represents the rib cage or the thorax. We've then got a rubber sheet at the bottom, which represents the diaphragm. Now, things that aren't shown here are the bronchioles and the alveoli. Now, a few wee questions that we might get in this. What part of the respiratory system is represented by the balloons? Is the lungs. And the part represented by the rubber sheet is the diaphragm. Not diagram. Diaphragm. When the rubber sheet is pulled down, the lungs inflate and they deflate when the rubber sheet is released. This model represents the features of the breathing process. Now, let's pause it there and I'll show you a little animation. So here we are, and here's our little animation. So what you can see here is, you pull the rubber sheet down and the balloons inflate. You push it up and the balloons go down. Pull it down, the lungs inflate. Push it up, the lungs deflate. Pretty cool, eh? Now, as I said, this represents the breathing process. So as the rubber sheet, which acts as the diaphragm, moves down, the volume inside the gas jar increases. This causes the pressure inside the glass jar to decrease. This causes air to enter the lungs until the pressure inside and outside the bell jar become equal. Now you can imagine then, if you push the rubber sheet up, the volume inside the glass jar decreases, which causes the pressure to increase inside the jar, so the air leaves. Now, one of the things that you need to know is the differences between the lung model and the process of breathing in humans, or sometimes this is referred to as limitations of the bell jar. So, while it's a really good example and a really good way to show you how breathing happens, it's not perfect, and there's several reasons for it. Firstly, in humans, the ribs move out and in and work together pardon me, with the diaphragm in changing the volume of the thorax. So, in humans, the ribs move out and in and work with the diaphragm to change the thorax. But in the lung model, only the diaphragm is involved. You'll have noticed in that little video that the glass jar doesn't move. The glass jar can't move. So in the lung model, only the diaphragm is involved. In humans, the diaphragm is normally dome-shaped, So in the little animations I showed you, the lungs were there and the diaphragm was dome shaped, and it flattens when you breathe in. Whereas in the bell jar, it starts flat and is pulled down. The final point then is the space between the lungs and the chest wall is much greater in the model than between the lungs and the rib cage in reality, which is what this shows. So here you can see that the lungs almost fill up this part of the rib cage, whereas here you can see these little balloons barely take up any space in the bell jar. Now let's go back to our wee body here, because the next wee part is gas exchange. So let's take a closer look inside the lungs. Here we go. So we're inside the lungs and we're going to the alveoli. Now we can see the two bronchi are here. They branch off into the bronchioles, and then the alveoli are the little air sacs. Now remember, this is where gas exchange takes place. To facilitate that, alveoli have a really good blood supply. So deoxygenated blood flows from the heart through the capillaries here. We breathe in and oxygen enters the blood and gets carried back to the heart. Meanwhile, the carbon dioxide diffuses out of the blood and then we breathe it out during exhalation. So what we're going to look at now is a little bit more about gas exchange. Now, gas exchange. If you think of a money exchanger, whenever you're going on your holidays, you take one form of money and change it for another type. So you might take pounds in and change it for euros. Gas exchange is similar to that. What happens is you basically exchange oxygen for carbon dioxide in the lungs. So what we're trying to do is get oxygen from the air that we breathe in, get it to join up with the red blood cells and get carried around the body. And then meanwhile, when the blood's in there, it's going to transport carbon dioxide so that you can breathe it out. And that's what gas exchange is. So if we look at this, basically to give you a little bit of an overview, what happens is air comes in during inhalation. It will contain lots of oxygen, and the oxygen will diffuse through the wall of the alveolus, through the wall of the capillary, into the red blood cells, and then the red blood cells will travel to the rest of the body, where it can be used by the cells in the rest of the body for respiration. So the oxygen which was in the red blood cells gets transported to the cells where it gets used for respiration. Now, of course we know that the equation for respiration is glucose plus oxygen, which produces carbon dioxide, plus water, plus energy. Now, the important product here that we need to think about is carbon dioxide. This carbon dioxide is produced in respiration and it's a waste product. So we need to get rid of it because it can't be allowed to build up in the body, otherwise the cells will die. So the carbon dioxide will get transported in the blood back to the lungs, and then in the blood the carbon dioxide will diffuse from the blood through the wall of the capillary, through the alveolus, into here, the airspace in the alveolus, and then we breathe it out. Now, the important part here is gas exchange. This happens in this region here. So let's look at it in a bit more detail. Now, this looks very complicated, but it's not too bad. So we've got O's represented as oxygen here, and X's represented as carbon dioxide. So the O's are oxygen, the X's are carbon dioxide. So we breathe in during inhalation, and we breathe lots of oxygen in. The oxygen then diffuses from the alveolus into the capillary, and it gets transported around the body to the respiring cells. The respiring cells use the oxygen to release energy, and they produce carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide then gets removed from the cells and transported in the blood back to the lungs, where it diffuses from the blood into the alveolus. We then breathe out the carbon dioxide so that it doesn't build up. Now, this is a very complicated diagram. Basically, what we need to be able to do here is label it and pick out the adaptations. So, here we have got this little upside down tree looking thing is an alveolus. This here is a capillary, which is a very small blood vessel. This part here would be a bronchiole. Now, after that, we need to think about its adaptations. So, there's several adaptations we can see here of the alveolus. Firstly, we can see its shape, which gives us a large surface area. Second of all, there's a good blood supply, which is important because it maintains the concentration gradient, which we'll come back and we'll talk about later on. We can also see that the capillary is close to the alveoli, which provides a short diffusion distance. We can also see that there is thin walls, which again produce a short diffusion distance. And the final thing is this moist lining here. Now, the moist lining allows the gases to dissolve before they diffuse. Now, I realise that's quite difficult, so let's have a quick blast over it again. So gas exchange refers to the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide which takes place between the air in the alveoli and blood vessels in the lungs. So where does it happen? In the alveoli. What is it? It's exchanging oxygen for carbon dioxide. Now, what has to happen is oxygen diffuses down a concentration gradient from the alveoli to the capillaries that surround them. The oxygen enters red blood cells and combines with hemoglobin to form oxyhemoglobin. Carbon dioxide that is carried in both blood plasma and as hydrogen carbonate and in red blood cells diffuses from the blood into the alveoli and then is breathed out by carbon dioxide. So that's sort of what we said. If this is your alveolus, this is your capillary. We have a high concentration of oxygen here. So oxygen diffuses from high to low, and that's oxygen, whereas carbon dioxide is in high concentration there, so it diffuses that way. Now then, you've got a little diagram. So let's draw this. So that can be the direction of blood flow. This is your capillary. These can be your little red blood cells. This is the alveolus. And this is air in. And this can be air out. So what happens is air comes in and that contains lots of oxygen. It diffuses through the wall of the alveolus, through the wall of the capillary and into the red blood cell, and then gets carried away to the rest of the body to the respiring cells. The carbon dioxide gets produced in respiration and it travels back to the lungs and diffuses from the blood into the alveolus, and then we breathe it out. And that's how gas exchange happens. Now, let's draw a flow chart to show the layers through which oxygen diffuses from the cavity of an alveolus to the cytoplasm of a red blood cell. So it starts in the alveolus. It has to diffuse through the wall of the alveolus. Then it has to go through the wall of the capillary. Then it has to diffuse through the cell membrane of the red blood cell, and then it finally reaches the cytoplasm. Now, all respiratory surfaces have to be adapted to be good at their job, which is to try and get as much oxygen into the blood as possible and remove carbon dioxide. Now, because the gases pass in and out of the alveoli by diffusion, they need to be adapted to be good at carrying out diffusion. Now, this table shows you a lot of detail, but I want to give you some bullet points here. Because this is going to be used for revision, I want you to be able to summarize this really quickly and really clearly. So the main adaptations that respiratory surfaces have is a large surface area. Now there's two reasons for that. Firstly, there's lots of alveoli, and second of all, the alveoli have a rounded shape. So this provides a large surface area for gas exchange. There is a steep concentration gradient. And the reason for this is, first of all, breathing, which brings fresh air into the lungs. And second of all, there is a good blood supply. And that's important because it carries oxygen away, so there is always a low concentration of oxygen in the blood. Now, another good reason or another adaptation is that the walls are permeable, which means that gases can diffuse easily. We also have very thin walls, which provides a short diffusion distance. And we should say here that the thin walls are of both the alveolar walls and the capillary walls. And the final one then is having moist walls, which allows the gases to dissolve before they diffuse. Now, just to tie all that together, so alveoli are well designed because they have got a good blood supply, which maintains a steep concentration gradient, moist lining to dissolve the gases, a large surface area, which helps the speed of diffusion, and they've also got very thin walls, which allows gases to pass through. Now, the final part of this topic is an investigation into the effect of exercise on breathing rate. So it's fairly straightforward. You basically take your resting breathing rate, which is how many breaths you take per minute while you're just sitting chilling out, and then you repeat that, but you do it after walking briskly and running on the spot for 5 minutes. you measure your breathing rate, and then you keep doing that every minute until it returns to normal, which is your recovery time. Now, typical questions you would get: do you think there's a link between levels of fitness and breathing rate? Why? Well, the fitter you are, the slower your breathing rate should be. And this is because when you exercise, your heart does not have to work as hard to deliver oxygen to muscles. So if you're fitter, you should actually have to breathe less often. Is there a link between levels of fitness and recovery time? So if you think of this, imagine you're walking up the stairs with your friends the whole way from, I don't know, the canteen up to biology. Are you out of breath? And if you are, compare that to your friends. Who's the most out of breath? So if a pupil becomes fitter over time, who would this affect and affect her recovery time? So basically, the fitter a pupil becomes, the quicker the recovery time. And this is because their heart muscle is stronger. So if you're fitter, it means that you're better at taking oxygen out of the air and transporting it to your muscles. So your recovery time should be shorter. Now, this is a typical question where it shows an investigation into how exercise affect the breathing rate of two boys. So we have Rory and Dean, two big mockers. So we've got them here at rest, then they exercise, and then we've got their recovery time, which was the time it takes to go back to normal. So at rest, if we break this down into different steps, we can see that at rest, Dean breathes more times per minute than Rory. During exercise, both boys' breathing rate increases, but Dean's increases by way more than Rory's. Afterwards, when they stop exercising, Rory's breathing rate goes back to normal quicker. So he's got a shorter recovery time. So typical questions you would get here. Who is fitter and why? It's Rory. And this is because he's got a lower resting breathing rate, which is right. He has a slower rate of increase during exercise, which again, the number of breaths he takes per minute doesn't increase as much as Dean. And then he also has a lower maximum breathing rate and a faster recovery. Now, the next little part then, and this is the final little section. So exercise involves the movement of muscle cells which use energy released from food molecules by cell respiration. This process requires oxygen and produces carbon dioxide. Now this is the important bit. Increased exercise means that the muscle cells will use more oxygen from the blood and produce more carbon dioxide. When that blood reaches the lungs, a larger volume of air is needed to replace the oxygen and remove the carbon dioxide. So therefore we've got an increased depth and rate of breathing, which is how we bring in a larger volume of air and increase the rate of gas exchange during exercise. So to summarize that, when we exercise, our muscles need more energy. They get that by carrying out more respiration. Because they respire more, they need more oxygen. As a result, we need to breathe more because that's where we get the oxygen from. Because we need to produce more energy, we also produce more carbon dioxide. So that's why you will start to breathe a lot heavier when you start to exercise. And that's the end of this topic, apart from these three little definitions. But it's been an absolute pleasure. Goodbye.